This begins our discussion on species and population. We need to first begin by defining what is a species. A species is a population of organisms that can breed to make more of its own kind. They only reproduce under natural circumstances. There are some organisms that are closely enough related genetically that they can reproduce, but they're not found in the same natural setting, so that does not occur naturally. An example of this would be lions and tigers. They are closely enough related genetically that they can reproduce to produce offspring, which would be called a liger. But a liger is not actually a species, because part of our definition of species is that they can breed to reproduce to make more of its own kind. And it occurs in a natural setting. Presently, we estimate that there are between 5 and 30 million species on Earth. We're not exactly sure of this because there is no central registry for species, so it makes it difficult to pinpoint exactly how many we have. An endangered species is one that is in imminent jeopardy of becoming extinct throughout a portion of its range. A threatened species is at lower risk than an endangered species, but they're likely to become an endangered species in the future. So what causes extinction and how are species protected? One of our main causes of extinction and species becoming threatened is habitat loss, or the degradation of a habitat. We also have an issue if non-native species become introduced into an environment. If species are overhunted or there is pollution and disease, all of these can factor into extinction or organisms becoming a threatened species. There is the Endangered Species Act of 1973 that was put into place with that has trade restrictions that are there to help try to protect threatened and endangered species. It also protects some of the critical habitats of these species so that they cannot be destroyed. What is speciation? This is a gene pool that is a combined genetic information for our particular population of organisms. Each species has its own common gene pool. If we have a gene pool of two populations and they are being separated, they cannot then reproduce, and this is how populations may develop into new species. Speciation is where we have the developing of our two species based on the populations becoming separated and ending up changing enough that they cannot reproduce. This is because we have organisms adapting to their natural surroundings and their environments in what we would refer to as natural selection. So what are causes of this? We have behavioral isolation, where it is two populations becoming capable of interbreeding due to the differences in their reproductive behaviors or their courtship manners. We have mechanical isolation, where the reproductive organs of two groups become so different that they can no longer mate over time. We have temporal isolation, where the mating occurs at different times or in different seasons. And we have geographic isolation, where we have populations that have been separated by geographic barriers that can prevent the reproduction. So what is interspecific competition? This is the competition between species to share the same resources at the same time. The principle of competitive exclusion is that two species competing for the same limited resources cannot both have thriving populations. And this is because they are competing to use the same resources at the same time. If one species has an advantage over the other species, it is more likely that they will dominate over time. This interspecific competition does not always result in one species dying out. It may lead to the other species developing new habits or changing to adapt to fit into the new habitat. In summary, a species is a population of organisms that can reproduce. Speciation occurs when the gene pool of two populations becomes so different that they can no longer reproduce. And interspecific competition is the competitions between two species to use the same resources at the same time. We will now begin our discussion on population. I want to begin our discussion on population by asking you a question. Would you rather be paid $5 an hour for a 20-hour week, or a salary that starts at 1 cent the first hour and doubles each hour up to 20 hours? Take a second and see if you can do the math to see which one of those you would rather do. So, if we look at this, $5 an hour over 20 hours is $100. 1 cent doubling every hour would give you $10,485. These are examples of linear growth and exponential growth. And this is what relates to our population growth. So, let's talk about linear and exponential growth based on our populations. Linear growth is also called arithmetic growth, and it shows a pattern increasing in a constant amount. Exponential growth is also called geometric growth. It shows a pattern increasing at a constant rate and doubling. So how do populations increase? Populations will increase exponentially. Our graph is called a J-graph because of its shape. Every species increases at a rate known as its biotic potential, and this is based on the habitat requirements and the reproduction rates. So why do our populations not increase indefinitely? They do not increase indefinitely because of limiting factors. Limiting factors are things that keep the populations in check and keep them from increasing forever. Limiting factors may include organisms moving in or out of the area, organisms dying off, and them not being replaced at the rate of death. Eventually, our populations will stabilize, and when they reach the stabilizing point, it is called the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the number of organisms that an organism can support over a long period of time. So what types of limits regulate population size? There are two types of limits that regulate the size of a population. They are density-dependent factors, and this has an increasing effect on the population. Examples are predators, disease, competition. So what happens as the population increases? Some of these things are more likely to happen. Like there's going to be more competition, there is going to be more issues with disease. Density-dependent factors are usually biotic, and remember, biotic means living. Density-independent factors are going to affect our populations no matter how big they are. Temperature, storms, floods, drought, these are usually abiotic. In summary, populations increase exponentially at a rate known as the biotic potential. Populations do not increase indefinitely because of limiting factors. What happens is over time our populations will stabilize and reach a carrying capacity. Two of the things that help regulate this are density dependent and density independent factors.